Ignorance of one's identity leads to inner conflict is my global issue, and the two texts that I've chosen are the literary work In the Name of Identity and the non-literary work The Best We Can Do. Um, I'm going to start off with the non-literary body of work The Best We Can Do. In the extract of pages 35 to 36 in The Best We Can Do, Bui uses panel, voiceover, and color to convey the inner conflict that arises when one ignores identity. So with panel in page 36, there's a big orange Vietnam that leaks over this panel. It's sort of a splash, and the angle of the hole in the back is also part of the panel, which signifies inner conflict with the author, the identity, because of her identity, where she's ignoring the Vietnamese part of her identity, and this leads to conflict between an inner conflict between her U.S. identity and Vietnamese identity. The panels also show that the father in pages 35 has family back in Vietnam, where he ignores his family, essentially ignoring his conflict, which leads to um, an inner conflict where he's ignoring his identity. And there's also no borders in page 36, which shows how there's an inner conflict. She's sort of by herself. Furthermore, the uses of voiceover on page 35, the father talks about how he, quote, my father always said he had no parents, end quote. But then Bui goes to Vietnam and sees her his family. This signifies the inner conflict that happens with the father because he is ignoring his identity, his Vietnamese identity. He uses the U.S. to escape the Vietnamese identity, where the author meets all of the family, even the father of the father, which creates an inner conflict with Bui, where the ignorance of identity and where she's trying to bridge the gap between the past and present. So Bui is trying to solve a conflict that she has because her dad won't identify with her Vietnamese identity, which creates an inner conflict with her. Finally, the usage of color on page 35. The father is surrounded by orange in panels 1 and 4. However, the family in Vietnam um, is not surrounded by orange. It shows how the father doesn't really want to identify with them. He's ignoring this part of his identity. Um, so it's like he's ignoring his identity, which leads to a inner conflict between them. However, in panel 3, there's sort of an orange hue at the bottom, so that could symbolize the part of identity where the father he's ignoring it, but it's still there, which creates a conflict. Um, page on page 36, there's sort of a wave and like an orange boat, like colored in, which could symbolize how the past, where the father escapes Vietnam, trying to escape his identity. Um, Furthermore, Vietnam is colored in orange. There's sort of the country that's colored, which could symbolize the identity that the father is ignoring, which leads to a conflict. Um, there's there's sort of a black hole on the outline of the author, which also symbolizes the inner conflict that the author is experiencing because the ignored identity. So this is also present in other parts of the novel, such as in chapter 3, Home the Holding Pen, where she gets a drink of water. She's ignoring other parts of her identity and is identifying with the Vietnamese superstition, which creates conflict because she's unable to sleep because of the haunting that the Vietnamese entities are doing. Furthermore, it is also present in chapter 4, where Bo is ignoring his Vietnamese past, um, and it leads to conflict. And in chapter 9, where the house burns down and they grab the papers, where they think that the papers are the only thing of their identity and they ignore other parts of it, which also leads to conflict. So that concludes my non-literary body of work, and I will be moving on to In the Name of Identity. In the extract of pages 11 to 12 on In the Name of Identity, Malouf uses allusion, anecdote, and rhetorical question to convey the inner conflict that occurs when one ignores their identity. So, firstly, the usage of allusion shows like they're alluding to countries such as the Serbian and then Sarajevo, and is alluding to cultures such as Muslim or like Yugoslavian, Bosnia, Herzegovina. So this establishes sort of an ethos where the reader is thinking that the author actually knows what they're talking about, and it takes information from other cultures to show that the conflict that occurs when one ignores identity. It shows how it's um it's making the argument stronger on identity. Furthermore, the usage of anecdote also helps prove the fact that ignorance of one's identity leads to inner conflict. So this anecdote in the passage is where the Maluf is talking about how a Serbian man and a Muslim woman get married, and but then he he creates a scenario where the Yugoslav he wants to he wants to know what the Serbian would identify was in certain situations, where he's ignoring his identity, which leads to conflict because he is identifying with only certain parts of his identity and other not other parts. This so for example, when he identifies as other parts of his identity, this would create an internal conflict because he's ignoring the other parts. Um, Finally, the usage of rhetorical question at the end of the passage, such as, how would this same person want to define himself if we made him in the same place 20 years hence? Which of his affiliations will put first? The usage of many rhetorical questions highlights the identity that this man is going to identify with. It's really highlighting the fact that he has many different identities and he's going to ignore certain ones, which creates an inner conflict with him because he yeah. So it's talking about like the different parts of his identity, where if he were to identify with only one part, it would lead to an inner conflict. Fi- um, This is this is the global issue of ignorance of one's identity leads to inner conflict is present throughout the, the rest of the novel. For example, in chapter 3, um, Maluf talks about how people who see their allegiances as an identity or they just ignore their identity leads to a consequence because of he talks about what determines a person's affiliation is the influence of others. So he if one doesn't identify with all of his identity, it leads to a conflict. This is also present in section 2, chapter 4, where he's talking about how religion influences people. So if one only identifies with the religious part of themselves, it leads to a conflict because he it leads to a conflict because it creates an inner conflict between identifying as the a religion and other parts of your identity. Finally, this is also present in section 2, chapter 4, section 2, chapter 1, where you're talking about how identity isn't connected with only one thing. So he's talking about how one who identifies with only one part of their identity leads to a conflict because their identity isn't connected with one thing. So, such as the part where he talks about um, the Taliban and Afghanistan. This concludes both of my analysis of the global issue, ignorance, where Ignorance of one's identity leads to inner conflict.